She walked into the diner on a quiet Tuesday, a limp in her step and silence in her eyes. Just a woman in a camo cap and a prosthetic leg. The laughter started before her order did. A cruel nickname, a phone recording, a fake salute. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. Just sat alone, steady as steel. But when 11 soldiers walked through the door an hour later, full dress, eyes forward, medals gleaming, everything changed. What happened next would silence the room, shatter the internet, and awaken a nation to the quiet power of standing tall. It was one of those dusty, late afternoons where the sun clung low to the horizon, burning orange behind the hills and washing the town in a soft, tired glow. The diner wasn't anything special. Worn red booths, a squeaky ceiling fan, and the smell of grilled onions that clung to your clothes after you left. Locals called it Betty's Place. Truckers called it a pit stop. That evening, it became something else entirely. She walked in quietly with a slight limp and a confidence that was quieter still. Her blonde ponytail was tucked beneath a camo cap, and the khaki canvas of her pants didn't quite hide the black carbon of her prosthetic leg. She moved with grace, not seeking attention, and slid into the booth near the window like she'd done it 100 times before. The waitress gave her a familiar nod. The other customers mostly didn't notice, except for the table of bikers near the back. Leather jackets, beer-bellied laughter, the heavy sound of boots kicking the floor as they tossed back bottles of soda and bragged about old stories that probably weren't true. One of them, a thick-bearded man with mirrored sunglasses still on indoors, nudged his buddy and jerked his chin toward her. "Combat Barbie," he said under his breath, loud enough for a couple heads to turn. A few chuckled. The joke wasn't clever, but it had venom. She said nothing. She took the menu, scanned it with calm eyes, then folded it and waited. The waitress returned, pad in hand, and asked the usual. "Turkey melt and fries?" She nodded. Then came the question, not from the waitress, but from the same man across the room. "What's the plastic leg for?" He didn't say it with curiosity. He said it with cruelty, like someone poking a bruise just to see the reaction. The diner went a little quiet, not silent, but tight. People looked up over their coffee cups. A fork paused halfway to someone's mouth. She didn't look up. She didn't answer. She let the weight of the moment settle over the table, then calmly reached for her glass of water and took a sip, her dog tags catching the sunset light as they shifted against her chest. One of the bikers pulled out his phone. He was filming now. Whispered narration over shaky Zoom. Combat Barbie with the robo-leg. No smile. No thanks. No manners. It was uploaded before her sandwich even hit the table. She ate quietly. When she paid her bill and stood to leave, no one stopped her. But several people kept watching. The waitress gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. The bikers laughed again. One barked a fake military salute and yelled, "Dismissed!" as she pushed through the door and limped back into the falling dusk. She didn't flinch, but the internet did. The video hit her old squad's group chat like a live grenade. They hadn't seen her in months, not since the desert, not since the blast, not since she was airlifted out while they stayed behind. They hadn't forgotten. And now, watching a grown man mock her while she stood alone in a diner, they didn't just remember. They reacted. Messages flew fast. "Where is this? Who filmed it? Betty's Place? Get me an address." By the time the sky turned fully dark over the sleepy town, something had shifted. Somewhere boots were hitting the ground. Uniforms were being pulled from closets. A convoy of pickups and 2 government-issue black SUVs were moving toward the coordinates dropped in the group chat. Inside Betty's, the night went on. The waitress refilled coffee. The bikers stayed late. And no one knew what was about to walk through the door. Not yet. The waitress was wiping down the counter when it happened. First, the bell above the door jingled like it always did, but the sound of it was followed by something different, a quiet shift in the air, a hush. Then one by one they stepped inside. 11 soldiers, boots polished, uniforms pressed. The first through the door was a woman, tall, dark-skinned, her beret pulled low, her eyes locked straight ahead. Behind her came men and women of all builds and backgrounds, all silent. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every customer stopped mid-sentence, mid-bite, mid-sip. Even the bikers looked up. The soldiers filed in, their formation tight despite the cramped diner space. They didn't move to sit or order. Instead, they formed a line down the center of the room facing the corner booth, the same booth she'd occupied just an hour before. And they stood there, at attention, still as statues. No one had ever seen anything like it. The waitress froze, clutching the coffee pot in both hands, blinking at the sudden military presence in her tiny cafe. The manager poked his head out from the kitchen, whispering, "What the hell is going on?" Then the sergeant stepped forward. Her boots thudded against the tile with each step until she stood directly in front of the stunned bikers. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. But somehow, the words she spoke reached every corner of the room. "She saved my life." That was it. Just 4 words. She turned to the rest of the diner, her voice clear, steady, calm. "That woman you laughed at, that combat Barbie you mocked, in Kandahar, I was pinned behind a Humvee that was on fire, smoke pouring, bullets flying. Everyone else froze. She didn't. She pulled me out with one arm and carried me over 600 yards on that leg you thought was funny. My femoral artery was cut. If she had been 1 minute slower, I'd be dead." No one moved. Not the staff, not the bikers, not the couple in the corner who had just been talking about getting a divorce over pie. Everyone just sat in it. "She was awarded the Bronze Star for that. You ever seen one of those?" the sergeant added, looking the biker straight in the eye. "Didn't think so." The man with the beard, the one who had laughed the loudest, looked down at his plate. His knuckles turned white as he gripped his fork. Another soldier stepped forward now, pulling something from his breast pocket. It was small, gleaming. He walked over to the waitress, who instinctively stepped aside and placed the metal gently on the counter. "We're here to pin this back where it belongs." The door swung open again, and there she was, same calm face, same quiet stride. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Her eyes scanned the room. The diners who had watched her get mocked, the waitress who had tried to protect her, the bikers who had called her names, and then the line of soldiers standing tall. Her unit. Her family. They hadn't told her they were coming. They hadn't needed to. She walked toward them slow and steady, as the sergeant turned and stood at attention. No one gave a command. The formation simply shifted. She stood with them. The metal was pinned again, properly this time, over her heart, by hands that knew what it meant. Then someone in the back started clapping. It was soft at first, unsure, but it caught. Another pair of hands joined in, then another. The sound grew, slow and steady, until the whole cafe was filled with it. Applause rising like a wave of penance, breaking across the linoleum floor. Even the biker stood. His hands trembled. His eyes were glassy. He cleared his throat, stepped forward, and said, "Ma'am, I was out of line. I'm sorry, I didn't know." She looked at him. Her face didn't soften, not right away, but she nodded just once. "That's the thing about respect," she said quietly. "You give it even when you don't understand." He nodded back, then turned to the soldiers. "Thank you, all of you." Outside, traffic continued as if nothing had changed. But inside Betty's, everything had. The video didn't just stop at the cafe, it rocketed through the web like a spark in dry grass. One moment it was just another clip in a chat. The next, it was on every screen. Reshared with captions like, "This is how you honor a hero," and "Combat Barbie? No, Combat Legend." People didn't see a wounded soldier anymore. They saw what the uniform had meant all along: strength wrapped in silence, courage that didn't ask for attention. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Her walking into the diner, her sitting alone, not reacting, the bikers laughing, and then the silence when her unit arrived, the speech, the medal, the tears no one tried to hide. It played on a loop, millions of views pouring in from people who didn't know her name, but now whispered it like a secret prayer. Hashtags surged. Old photos of her from deployment surfaced. Her squad mates began posting their own tributes. One wrote, "She carried more weight on that leg than most men carry on two." Another, "I owe her more than I could ever repay." The cafe itself became a landmark overnight. Reporters called. Local news vans parked outside, cameras angled to catch the exact spot where she had stood. Betty, the owner, was stunned. "She's been coming here for months," she said in a trembling voice. Never asked for a discount, never mentioned the leg, just ordered her turkey melt and left a good tip. People showed up. Locals who had never spoken to her now brought flowers. Children left hand-drawn pictures taped to the window. One crayon drawing simply said, "Thank you for being brave." She didn't say much about the video, didn't post a reaction, didn't chase interviews. But she saw it, and she saw the messages, one by one, from women across the country, from girls who had never thought of enlisting until they saw her hold her head high in that tiny diner. "I used to think I couldn't do it. Now I think maybe I can. My dad never believed I had it in me, but you made me believe I do. I signed my papers today. Thank you." The weight of those words hit harder than the blast that took her leg. She remembered being 19, in the freezing cold of basic training, soaked in sweat and fear, trying to disappear. She remembered every sideways look, every nickname, every time someone told her to smile. She remembered how it felt to run until her lungs burned, to climb ropes with bleeding palms, to outshoot half the platoon and still be asked if she was sure about the Army. And now, girls were standing taller because they saw her stand. The cafe gave her a permanent table, corner booth, freshly painted, with a small brass plaque above it, reserved for Staff Sergeant E. Riley, Bronze Star recipient. Beneath it, a photo, taken mid-clap, mid-tears, of her standing among her brothers and sisters in uniform, medal newly pinned, the past and the present colliding in one frozen moment. Betty had the picture framed and hung it right over the cash register. People touched it like it was sacred. Even the bikers returned. Not to mock, but to sit quietly at the counter, order their meals, and sometimes leave without a word. The man who had said the words that started it all left a handwritten note folded under the salt shaker one morning. It read, "I was wrong. You showed me what real strength looks like. Thank you." She never acknowledged it. She didn't need to, because the world had already shifted, and her silence was louder now than their laughter had ever been. Not long after, her mother sat on the edge of her couch in a small apartment 2 states away, watching the evening news with her hand covering her mouth. She cried when the footage played, not because of the medal, but because she saw her daughter, whole and strong and no longer alone. And when the camera panned to the plaque in the diner, her mother whispered, "They finally see you the way I always have." Later that week, she received an invitation, a letter embossed with an eagle, signed by a colonel. They wanted her to speak, not at a ceremony, not at a PR event, but at boot camp, to the newest recruits, to the ones about to learn what pain and purpose really meant. She thought about it long and hard. She didn't like stages, didn't like applause, but she said yes, not for herself, but for the girl who had once cried in the barracks, wondering if she'd ever be enough, and for every girl who might one day lace up boots and wonder the same. She walked into that auditorium months later in full dress uniform. The recruits sat straighter when they saw the medal, but they leaned forward when she started to speak. and she began not with her name or her rank, but with a story about a little diner, a prosthetic leg, and what happens when you stand tall even when the world wants to cut you down. And somewhere in the back row, a young woman, barely 18, wiped her eyes, straightened her spine, and whispered, "That's who I want to be." Local schools began to take notice. At first, it was just a history teacher who'd seen the viral clip and decided to show it during a lesson about modern-day service. He'd expected a few distracted glances, maybe some whispers. Instead, by the end of the video, half the classroom was silent, a few kids blinking hard to keep their eyes dry. A week later, another teacher printed out the story, passed it around in English class, and asked students to write about courage. One girl wrote, "Courage is walking into a place where you've been laughed at and standing tall anyway. Courage is not needing anyone to clap, but making them want to." The principal heard about it, then the superintendent, and soon it became a school-wide reading assignment. Not because it was viral, but because it was true, because it touched something so rarely talked about, quiet strength, earned respect, the kind of bravery that didn't come from chasing attention, but from surviving what others couldn't even imagine. She didn't know about any of it, not until she got the envelope. In it was a handwritten letter signed by 173 high school students. They had written it together during homeroom. "We saw the way you handled hate with grace," it said. "You didn't yell. You didn't post revenge. You didn't need to. You inspired us more in silence than most people do screaming. Thank you for showing us that strength doesn't always look like what we expect." She sat on her porch that evening, rereading the letter as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Her service dog dozed at her feet. The world around her buzzed with the kind of calm she used to dream about when she was deployed. And for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long while: peace. But the story didn't stop there. One morning, as she waited all in line at the grocery store, holding a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs, a young man in uniform walked in. He looked fresh from basic, hair cut too tight, posture too proud, face still soft with uncertainty. He saw her. His eyes widened. And without hesitation, he walked straight toward her. No pause, no nerves. He came to attention right there between the frozen peas and the detergent aisle, and he saluted. She blinked, took a step back, unsure for a second, but then he said, voice cracking slightly, "Ma'am, I enlisted because of you, that video, that story. I just wanted to say thank you." She didn't cry, not in public, but something in her chest cracked open, and with a nod she returned the salute. Sharp, clean, perfect. The cashier had stopped scanning. People were watching again, but this time the weight in the air wasn't judgment. It was reverence. Later, she left the store with her groceries in hand, and a new warmth in her heart. Not pride exactly, something deeper. The kind of knowing that comes when you realize your pain planted seeds you never intended, and those seeds are now growing into something good. That week, something unexpected happened. One of the bikers from the diner, not the loudest, not the one who had posted the video, but a middle-aged guy with a gray braid and calloused hands, stopped by her house. He didn't knock at first, just stood by the gate holding a flyer. She spotted him from the window and stepped outside. He looked nervous. "Hope this isn't weird," he said, scratching at his beard. I started something, a charity ride, for vets. Called it the Combat Barbie Ride. I know that name started bad, but I figured maybe we could take it back, make it mean something real." She stared at him for a long beat. He shifted awkwardly. "I got 20 guys signed up already. All proceeds go to wounded vet programs. Thought maybe you'd ride lead, if you wanted." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the gate, took the flyer, and read every word. Then, finally, she looked up and said, "Only if we change the name." He nodded immediately. "Done. A week later, the streets rumbled with the sound of engines and patriotism. Dozens of bikers rode through town, flags flying behind them, patches gleaming in the sun. She led the way on a custom-built trike with her unit's insignia on the side and the words, "Ride with Respect," painted across the back. People lined the sidewalks, kids waved flags, veterans saluted from their lawns, and the sign outside Betty's place changed too, simple black lettering on white paint. But the words carried more weight than most monuments. Veterans always welcome, and everyone knew exactly why. She didn't seek out cameras. She never liked being the center of anything. But still, the requests came. Emails, calls, invitations to interviews, panels, podcasts. She turned most of them down, not because she didn't appreciate the attention, but because that kind of spotlight had never been the goal. But one invite stood out. It was from a small all-girls high school across the state. The subject line read, "We don't need a speaker, we need a hero." Attached was a video, cell phone footage of a classroom watching the diner clip together, their faces lit up with emotion. A girl whispering, "She looks like me." She watched the clip 3 times before replying, "I'll come." When she arrived at the school, they had lined the hallway with tiny American flags and construction paper thank you notes. The gym had been converted into a stage. No cameras, no press. Just rows and rows of teenage girls sitting cross-legged on the floor, their eyes wide with admiration, their notebooks open, waiting. She didn't talk about war. She didn't talk about pain. She talked about silence. About walking through a world that sometimes didn't see you. About being strong enough to let people underestimate you, and still standing tall. About how respect wasn't something you demanded, but something you wore, like your scars, like your name tag, like your truth. When she finished, there was no applause at first, just stillness. Then, a single voice from the back, "Thank you." And the clapping began, not wild or dramatic, but steady, grateful, honest. Afterward, the youngest girl in the room approached her with a question that stayed in her bones long after the event ended. "Were you ever scared?" She bent down, met the girl's eyes, and said, "Yes, every day, but I never let fear do the talking." That girl is now in her 2nd year at West Point. Back in town, Betty's Diner had started something new. The corner booth, now often filled with flowers and letters, was officially named the Veterans Table. Anyone who had served could sit there and eat free of charge. No fanfare, just quiet gratitude. One afternoon she returned, unannounced, as usual. As she walked through the door, the room stilled, but not out of shock. It had become a kind of ritual now. The bell above the door jingled. A few heads turned. A few hearts skipped. And then something remarkable happened. Without anyone saying a word, a young man stood from the booth in the corner. He stepped aside and gestured to her with a smile. "It's your seat, ma'am." She smiled softly, gave him a nod, but said, "It's ours. Sit with me." So they did. He had served in Afghanistan too, lost 2 friends in an ambush. Hadn't spoken about it much, not even to his family. But over coffee and fries, he found himself opening up, about the guilt, the noise, the silence that came afterward. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. And when he finished, she said only, "You carried them home, every step since." He exhaled like he hadn't in years. The next morning, the cafe phone rang. It was a reporter, again. They wanted to know if she would be willing to pose for a national campaign honoring veterans. "Tell them I'll think about it," she said, "but only if they include the others." That afternoon, she met with her unit at a park near the old training base. The trees were still bare, the wind still sharp. But when they stood together again, side by side, it felt like summer. There was laughter, remembrance, and a new photo taken. This one not in uniform, but in unity. No medals, no salutes, just people who had carried each other through fire. The campaign went live the following month. It didn't have a flashy headline, just a title in small print. Service isn't always seen. Her portrait was front and center, her eyes calm, the faintest smile on her face. And in the background, just slightly blurred, you could see a line of soldiers standing quietly behind her. It became one of the most shared images of the year, and yet, when asked about it by a local reporter weeks later, she shrugged and said, "It's not my story. It's ours." Because that was always the truth. She had walked into a diner for a turkey melt and walked out a symbol, but she never saw herself that way. She saw herself as a sister in arms, a daughter, a friend, a soldier who got back up because someone else had taught her how. And as more people learned her name, not from headlines, but from whispers passed in classrooms, on sidewalks, in training camps, something beautiful happened. She became less of a myth and more of a mirror, a reflection of what bravery looks like when no one is watching. A few months later, she received an invitation that made her pause. It wasn't from a school or a news station. It wasn't a press request or a military function. It was handwritten, folded neatly in a plain envelope left at Betty's diner. The hostess said a man in a leather vest dropped it off and left without giving his name. Inside it read, "We're organizing a ride for suicide prevention, for vets. It's personal for a lot of us. You don't know me, but I know you. You gave me back something I thought I lost the day I came home. Hope. Would be an honor if you showed up. No big title, no pressure, just a request." She stared at the note for a long time. Suicide prevention wasn't a headline. It wasn't polished, but it was real. The weight of it settled in her bones. She had lost friends to silence, to shadows, to the things they couldn't unsee or unfeel. She carried their names in her phone, some still unanswered, some frozen in unread texts. She folded the letter, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and said yes. The morning of the ride, the sky was iron gray. Rain threatened to fall, but didn't. Rows of motorcycles lined the parking lot of a veterans center. Leather jackets, dog tags, old boots and new scars. And in the middle of it all, her. Dressed in jeans, a plain t-shirt, and boots that had been through 3 deployments. She didn't speak at the mic. She didn't need to. She just showed up. And for some, that was everything. During the ride, she rode beside a man whose son had taken his own life after coming home. They didn't talk much, but at a rest stop he looked at her and said he would have looked up to you. She placed her hand over his, nodded, and replied, "Then let's ride for him." By the end of the day, the charity raised more than they had the past 3 years combined. But more than that, people stayed, talked, shared numbers, started something that could last longer than a single ride. And someone, standing near a row of helmets, whispered, "She shows up for all of us." That whisper made it back to the mayor's office. A week later, a formal city declaration was made. One day each year would be officially recognized as Staff Sergeant Riley Day, a day to honor veterans, community unity, and silent strength. Flags went up around town. Local businesses offered free meals. And at Betty's, the veterans' table was covered in white roses. She hadn't wanted a day. But when she stepped outside that morning and saw a group of kids with signs that read, "Thank you, Sergeant," she couldn't help but smile. That smile made the front page of the paper the next day. Later that afternoon, she returned to the cafe. The air buzzed with quiet energy. People nodded respectfully. No one swarmed her. But they noticed. They always noticed now. And sitting in her usual spot was a young woman in her early 20s, nervous, fidgeting with a patch on her sleeve. The moment their eyes met, the girl stood sharply and saluted, nearly knocking over her coffee. "Permission to sit, ma'am?" Riley smiled. "You don't need permission. Sit." The girl did. Her name was Clara. She had just finished her first round of field training. She was scared, overwhelmed, wondering if she'd made the right choice. And then she said something Riley would never forget. "I watched that video of you probably 50 times. Not the speech, not the medal. Just the way you didn't flinch. That's how I knew I could do this." Riley reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded cloth, her old field band, the one she wore during the last deployment. She slid it across the table. "Keep it," she said. "When things get hard, remember, silence doesn't mean weakness. And grace doesn't mean surrender." Clara blinked fast, then nodded. That night, Riley sat on her porch again, watching the sky fade to navy. Her phone buzzed. Another message, this one from the biker who had started the first charity ride. "We're thinking of doing a scholarship in your name for daughters of vets. Call it Riley's Girls. You okay with that?" She didn't hesitate. Make it happen. And just like that, another ripple spread. In a world that had once laughed at a woman walking into a diner on a prosthetic leg, now that same world was moving in her footsteps, toward compassion, toward service, toward something better. The scholarship launched quietly. No press release, no big campaign, just a small form on a website and a mission: to support daughters of veterans pursuing leadership, service, or skilled trades. Within a week, the inbox flooded. Letters came in from every corner of the country, handwritten essays, grainy photos of dads in desert camo, moms in hospital beds holding newborns, medals framed in wooden cases next to folded flags. Each one told a story of loss, of grit, of dreams too often shelved because of sacrifice. Riley read every single one. She'd sit at Betty's with a black coffee and a stack of envelopes, tears slipping down silently as she underlined names, scribbled notes in the margins. One girl wanted to become a firefighter like her mom. Another had been living out of a car with her siblings after their father's VA benefits got delayed. A third wanted to go into robotics, to build better prosthetics. That one made her pause. She reached into her boot and pulled out the tiny adjustment tool she always carried, the one she used to tweak her leg on cold days. She set it on the table, stared at it, then whispered, "Give her everything she needs." 3 girls were selected that year. Riley met them at the diner. No speeches, no staged photo ops, just pancakes and orange juice and shy grins as she handed them each a letter with the scholarship details and a hug that said more than any words could. Later that day, as she walked out to her truck, one of the girls followed her. "You don't seem like how I imagined," she said. "I thought you'd be louder." Riley smiled, opened the door, and said, "I'm loud in the places that matter." That phrase stuck. It became a motto on the scholarship site. It was printed on stickers, then shirts. Loud in the places that matter. Not about volume, about presence, integrity, quiet force. And presence had become her legacy, one she carried with humility. That fall, the mayor's office reached out again, this time not to honor her, but to ask for her help. A small town nearby had a veterans shelter that was underfunded and falling apart. They wanted to tear it down, replace it with something cheaper. But some council members thought it deserved saving, thought maybe she could help sway the vote. She visited the shelter that afternoon. It smelled like old paint and bad coffee. But the men and women inside? They lit up when she walked through the door. One woman with a cane whispered, "I saw the video. I watch it every month when I feel invisible." Riley sat with them, asked what they needed, listened. Then, at the next city council meeting, she stood at the back until they called her name. The room hushed the moment she stepped up to the mic. "I'm not here for a headline," she said. "I'm here because you don't leave your people behind. Not in combat, not in poverty, not in silence. These walls may be cracked, but inside them are lives that still have fight left." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The shelter got its funding 2 weeks later. They renamed it Valor House. Outside Betty's, the changes kept coming too. One crisp Saturday morning, as leaves scattered across the sidewalk like confetti, the cafe held a quiet unveiling. A portrait, larger than life, now hung in the main dining area, not from the viral video, not from the newspaper shoot, but from a candid photo someone had taken during the first charity ride. Riley in her trike, hair tied back, eyes calm as ever, wind tugging at the edge of her vest. Above the frame, a single word in carved wood: respect. When she walked in that morning and saw it, she didn't speak, just stood there. One hand lightly touched the edge of the frame. The cafe fell into stillness, not out of formality, but reverence. Someone near the counter whispered, "She deserves more than medals." She turned and smiled. "I've got everything I need right here." Later that afternoon, she returned home to find another invitation on her porch. This one was different. It was from a military museum. They wanted to add her story to a permanent exhibit, one dedicated to modern heroes whose courage had changed civilian life. Not for what they did on the battlefield, but for what they did after. At first she hesitated, but then she remembered the recruit who saluted her at the grocery store, the young girl at the high school, the veteran who said she gave him back his hope. And she nodded. "Yeah," she whispered. "Let's make sure they're never forgotten." The museum exhibit opened on a cold November morning, the kind where breath fogs in the air and every gust of wind feels like it carries stories from far-off places. Veterans, students, families, and active-duty soldiers lined the walkways. Not for fireworks, not for celebration, but for presence, for respect. Inside, her story had its own space, a corner tucked beside a large display of war letters and battlefield relics. But it didn't feel like a war memorial. It felt like a quiet room in the heart of a storm. Photos lined the walls, not just of her, but of the people who had been changed by her grace. The unit standing tall in the diner, the first charity ride. The handshake with a biker-turned-advocate, the girl in uniform who had followed her into service. At the center was her prosthetic leg. Not the one she wore now, but her first, scuffed, scratched, and etched with tiny marks from every corner she'd turned and every mile she'd walked since the explosion. Beneath it was a quote carved into steel: "Grace in silence, strength in shadow, loud in the places that matter." She arrived unannounced. Dressed in her everyday clothes, a hoodie and jeans, ball cap low over her brow. She walked the exhibit slowly, reading every panel, brushing her fingers lightly across the glass. A curator noticed her. His eyes went wide. He stepped forward, but she gently shook her head. No attention, just space. Then from behind her, a voice. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you." She turned. A young man stood there in uniform, his hands shaking slightly, a museum pamphlet clutched in one fist. "My sister was one of the first Riley's girls. She's in med school now. We didn't have much growing up, but you changed everything." She smiled, placed a hand on his shoulder. "She did the work," she said. "I just held the door open." And that's what it had become, a door. One she had kicked wide open and left there, never expecting applause, never needing credit, just making sure others could walk through. She left the museum quietly, but something followed her out. The weight of being someone's symbol. It never felt like a burden, just a responsibility, a promise that her pain wouldn't be wasted. That night, back at home, she sat on her porch again, the stars flickering like they were winking down at her. Her dog lay curled at her feet. A slow hum of motorcycles echoed in the distance. Another ride, another cause. She didn't need to lead them anymore. Her presence had multiplied. The next morning, she returned to Betty's. The smell of eggs and bacon, the scratch of forks on ceramic, the same warmth it always had. But something new caught her eye. A sign posted right on the front window, hand-painted in bold blue letters. "Veterans always welcome." Not just a sentiment now, a promise. Inside, Clara sat at the corner booth, the one Riley used to claim for herself. She had a stack of papers in front of her, a half-empty cup of coffee, and a face full of nerves. Riley slid into the seat across from her. "Paperwork?" she asked. Clara nodded. "First leadership assessment. I feel like I'm in way over my head." "You are," Riley said without hesitation. "And that's exactly where leaders grow." Clara smiled. "You ever feel like that?" "Every day," Riley said. "But I did the job anyway." A moment passed between them. Not quite silence, not quite conversation, just understanding. Then Clara leaned forward. "What do I do when they doubt me?" Riley took a sip of coffee and replied, "You let them, and then you outwork every last one of them until their doubt turns into respect." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a speech, but it landed. Clara sat up straighter, and somewhere behind the counter, Betty wiped a tear from her cheek. News of the scholarship, the exhibit, and the rides began to spread to places Riley would never visit. Schools in other states made her story part of their curriculum. Recruiters told it during training sessions. A documentary crew reached out. She declined, but they still featured her story through the people she'd impacted. And one afternoon, as she passed the cafe on a walk, she noticed a family stepping outside. A little girl, no more than 8, pointed at the sign on the window and asked her dad, "What's a veteran?" He knelt, pulled her close, and said, "Someone like her." Riley paused. The father looked up, recognition dawning slowly. She gave him a soft smile, nodded, and kept walking. Somewhere behind her, the little girl whispered, "She looks like a superhero." And in that moment, Riley knew she'd become something more than a story. She'd become a reason. That winter came in hard and early. Snow drifted against curbs like frozen ocean waves, and the cold bit through coats and boots with the kind of chill that reminded Riley of bivouac nights in the desert, when the heat vanished after sunset, and the silence made your thoughts louder than gunfire. But even the sharp wind couldn't stop the steady stream of people showing up at Betty's. The place had become more than a diner now. It was a destination, a waypoint, a place where people came to leave letters, share stories, and sometimes to sit across from Riley herself. She never called attention to it, never claimed it. But the corner booth was where healing happened, where hands shook, where hearts softened. It was on one of those freezing mornings that a man walked in with a look that said he'd taken a long road to get there. He was older, mid-60s maybe, worn boots, denim jacket over a Vietnam-era fatigue shirt, and a biker patch on his sleeve. His knuckles were red from cold, and his jaw worked tightly as he scanned the room. When his eyes landed on Riley, something in him stilled. He moved toward her table slowly, like each step was weighed down by decades. She looked up, nodded slightly. "Sit?" He eased down onto the bench, hands clasped on the table, eyes not quite meeting hers. "I was one of them," he said quietly. "Back then, the ones who spit, the ones who laughed. When our boys came home from Nam, I was a kid and I didn't get it. I mocked a man in uniform once, and he didn't say a word, just walked away. I never forgot his face." He paused, exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for years. "I saw your video, and it brought him back. I think I've been carrying that shame ever since." Riley said nothing, just let the silence do its work. Then she reached across the table, placed her palm over his. "You're here," she said. "That matters." He swallowed hard, nodded. "I started volunteering at a vet center, helping clean, talk to the guys. I guess I figured it's never too late to serve someone who already has." Riley gave his hand a small squeeze. "It's not." That conversation never made the news, but the man's next steps did. He launched a program in his hometown called Second Salute, a community service initiative for civilians who wanted to make amends, yard work for elderly vets, grocery runs, listening hours at VA hospitals. Within months, it had chapters in 4 states, and every single volunteer was given a card that simply read, "Respect Earned Backward," inspired by SSG E. Riley. Riley found out from a reporter who called to confirm a quote She just smiled and said, "Tell him I'm proud of him." Not long after, a high school reached out with a strange request. They weren't asking her to speak. They were asking if they could name their gym after her. Riley blinked at the email. A gym? She almost said no. Almost sent back a polite decline, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the thought of young girls running laps under her name, growing stronger, without even realizing whose shoulders they stood on. Maybe it was the idea that a place dedicated to strength could echo her story long after she was gone. So she said yes. The ceremony was simple. No ribbon cutting, just a quiet Saturday morning, a few families, a small local band, and a banner that read, "The E. Riley Hall of Quiet Strength." As the school principal handed her the plaque, he said, "This isn't just about what you did, it's about what you didn't let stop you." Later, during the open gym time, Riley sat on the bleachers and watched a group of young girls run drills. They were fast, fierce, loud. One girl tripped, fell hard, scraped her knee. She sat there, blinking back tears. Riley stood slowly, walked to her. "You okay?" The girl nodded, sniffling. "You gonna get back up?" The girl nodded again. "Good," Riley said. "Because strength isn't how loud you yell when you win. It's how quiet you get when you rise." That moment went unrecorded, but it became a story passed down in that school for years. A legend. Spring crept in slowly that year. By March, the snow had melted from the rooftops, and the buds on the dogwoods were threatening to bloom. Riley had taken to walking the trail behind the VA hospital most mornings. It wasn't long, but it was quiet. It helped her breathe. One morning, she saw someone waiting at the trailhead. A girl, 16, maybe 17, backpack slung over both shoulders, hands twisting nervously. "You don't know me," the girl said, "but I wrote to your scholarship program. I didn't get it." Riley tilted her head, waiting. "I was mad. At first, I didn't understand. I thought, why her, not me? And then I saw your video again, and I realized I've been looking for shortcuts, for praise. I haven't earned it yet. I wanted to say thank you for showing me that, for showing me what it really takes." She reached into her bag and pulled out a journal. "This is for you. I wrote everything I've learned since I applied. I'm still going to serve, still going to apply next year, but this is just something I needed to leave with you." Riley took the journal, ran her fingers over the frayed spine. "You didn't lose," she said. "You grew." The girl smiled, cheeks pink, with both emotion and early spring wind. They parted without a photo. No witness, but Riley knew, seeds don't need cameras to grow. And something told her this girl would bloom into someone the world needed. It began with a knock on her door, not urgent, not loud, but steady, like someone who didn't want to intrude but also wasn't going to walk away. Riley opened it to find a woman standing there with a clipboard and a cautious smile. She looked young, early 30s maybe, with wind-tousled hair and tired eyes. Her jacket had a small nonprofit logo stitched above the heart. "Sorry to drop in," she said. "I'm Claire. I run a community housing initiative for female veterans. We're starting a mentorship program. Someone on my team used to serve with you. They said you might be willing to talk." Riley stepped aside. "Come in?" They talked for nearly an hour. Claire explained the program, how female vets, especially single mothers, were falling through the cracks after service. How even now, in 2025, some couldn't get consistent mental health support or job placement. How the transition home still felt like another battlefield. "We're not looking for a figurehead," she said. "We're looking for someone who's walked it, who knows what it feels like to limp into a world that expects you to sprint." Riley nodded slowly. She didn't make promises easily. But something in her recognized the weight in Claire's voice, the kind of urgency you only hear when someone's seen too much. "I'll help," she said, "not for your brochure, but for them." And that's how Riley became a mentor. Not to crowds, to individuals. Women came one at a time. They sat at her kitchen table. Some couldn't meet her eyes. Some cried before they could speak. Some had kids waiting in the car, unsure of who this woman was or why their mother needed to see her. But Riley knew what they were carrying: the ache of things left unsaid, the guilt of surviving, the confusion of becoming civilian again after years of being forged in fire. And she met each woman where she was. One said she felt like she didn't belong anywhere anymore. Riley handed her a shovel and pointed to the garden. "Start here, belong to this." Another said she was too broken to love again. Riley placed her prosthetic on the porch rail and said, "Tell that to this leg. It's built from wreckage." Another couldn't even speak. She sat shaking, breathing fast, words stuck in her throat. Riley just sat beside her. No questions, no judgment, only a cup of tea, a blanket, and the silent kind of presence that says, "I've been there too." Word spread quietly, not on social media, not through news channels, just whispers from woman to woman. "She listens. She sees me. She doesn't flinch." Eventually, Claire asked Riley to give a short talk at their annual fundraiser. Just a few words, 5 minutes. Riley agreed, though reluctantly. When the night arrived, the room was filled with donors and dignitaries, wine glasses and silver place settings. But at the center table sat 6 women Riley had mentored, and the kids they were raising, many of whom didn't even know what their mothers had endured. Riley stepped up to the mic in a simple dress shirt and slacks. No medals, no script. She scanned the crowd, then said, "I was told this talk should be inspiring, but survival isn't always inspiring. It's messy, it's painful, it's quiet. What these women have done isn't flashy, it's harder. They've come home, they've stayed standing, and now they're helping others do the same. That's courage. That's the kind of strength I follow." The applause was thunderous. But she didn't wait to soak in it. She returned to her seat, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a woman beside her who had once tried to end her life and now ran peer support circles. Later that night, a donor approached her. "I don't give money to many causes," he said, "but I believe in what you've done. Can I fund 10 more mentorships in your name?" Riley didn't hesitate. "Fund them in theirs." He nodded. And that's how the Riley Circle was born. 10 mentors, all women who had survived, all committed to guiding others. The name wasn't hers by ego, it was hers by action. And every time a new mentee joined, they received a small card with a quote, "The quiet ones often carry the loudest stories." Riley never signed them. She didn't need to. By then, her name had already become something bigger than a signature. It had become a signal, a promise, that if you stood with her, you'd never stand alone. It was just after dawn when the call came. Not from the military, not from media, from a teacher. Her name was Hannah, a middle school language arts instructor from a rural town Riley had never heard of. She spoke softly, almost apologetically, as if unsure she had any right to make the request. "I know you probably get asked this a lot," she said, "but my kids, they read about you in a magazine. Then they watched the diner video. Then we did a whole unit on it. And, well, they wrote you letters. I know it's asking a lot, but if there's any way you could stop by, even for 5 minutes, I think it would change their lives." Riley agreed, not because of the request, but because of the voice behind it. There was something in Hannah's tone, something unpolished, raw. It reminded her of the woman who'd handed her a medal in silence, the first waitress who'd ever looked her in the eye and treated her like someone who mattered. She drove out 2 weeks later. The town was small, a blinking stoplight, a diner that looked eerily like Betty's, and a school built more from heart than funding. The principal greeted her at the front with a handshake and a wide-eyed smile. "We're honored," he said. "The kids, they didn't believe you'd really come." "They will," she said, tucking her hands into her coat. They led her to the library, where 27 students sat in folding chairs, fidgeting, whispering, eyes wide. On the wall behind them, handmade posters. "Welcome, Sergeant Riley," and "Thank you for your quiet strength." She didn't prepare a speech. She just sat on the edge of a desk and spoke plainly. "When I was your age," she began, "I thought courage looked like capes and loud voices. I thought it meant you had to be fearless. But that's not true. Courage is getting up when you're terrified. It's walking back into rooms where you were laughed at and standing anyway. It's listening more than you talk." A boy in the front row raised his hand. "Were you scared in the diner?" Riley nodded. "Yes, not because I was outnumbered, but because silence can feel like a verdict." Another asked, "Well, why didn't you say anything back?" "I didn't need to," she said. "Some battles don't need yelling. They need dignity." And just like that, those students, some from broken homes, some who had never even seen a military uniform up close, sat straighter, wrote more honestly, thought more deeply. At the end of the visit, the students handed her their letters, folded, decorated, filled with scribbled thanks and shaky declarations of future service. One note read, "You didn't save just soldiers. You saved kids like me who thought being quiet meant being weak." As she walked to her truck afterward, Hannah caught up with her. "I know you probably have 10 places to be," she said, "but I just wanted to say thank you for making the quiet kids feel seen." Riley smiled, pulled a worn patch from her jacket pocket, the same one she used to wear under her vest, and pressed it into the teacher's hand. "You're the one doing the saving now." Back on the road, she didn't turn on the radio, just drove in silence, letting the hum of the engine and the weight of what had just happened settle deep into her bones. It wasn't just about students, it was about legacy, not carved into monuments but passed hand to hand, voice to voice. Late April brought with it the scent of earth and blooming things. Trees shook off their sleep. Birds returned to the power lines. And with the changing season came an invitation Riley didn't expect. It was from the Department of Defense. They were hosting a private ceremony to honor non-combat contributions to national morale, people whose actions had made a measurable difference in veteran well-being, civilian enlistment interest, and public perception of the military. Her name was at the top of the list. She considered not going. She wasn't interested in applause, but the idea of standing alongside others who had carried unseen burdens, that mattered. She arrived in D.C. in a black blazer, slacks, and polished shoes. Her prosthetic leg had a fresh carbon shell, not to hide it, but to honor it. Her dog tags, worn thin from years of brushing against her chest, hung neatly under her blouse. The room was filled with generals, advocates, caregivers, and veterans. The air buzzed with quiet reverence, not the puffed-up kind, but the kind that came from shared silence, from knowing nods, from pain that didn't need translation. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the front. The speaker read from a file. Staff Sergeant Riley is recognized not only for her service in combat, but for her unparalleled demonstration of post-service leadership, grace under fire, and advocacy through presence. She has become, for many, the face of a quieter kind of courage, one that does not seek praise but earns it. She was handed a small gold pin in the shape of an open door. Behind her, someone whispered, "That's what she is, a door." She didn't speak, just bowed her head, accepted the honor, and returned to her seat. After the ceremony, she stepped outside. The air was thick with city sounds, taxis, distant shouting, the low hum of history. A young woman in dress uniform approached her near the fountain. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm shipping out next week, and I just wanted to say, I used to think I wasn't tough enough to serve, until I saw how you walked into that diner." Riley didn't smile. She placed a hand on the woman's shoulder and said, "You're more than tough enough. You're ready." Then she turned, walking into the afternoon light, the pin on her chest glinting in the sun, a door always open for whoever needed to walk through next. May rolled in on warm breezes and the smell of grass cut fresh after rain. The town was preparing for Memorial Day, Flags along sidewalks, wreaths at the foot of statues, and local kids rehearsing the national anthem in school gyms that echoed too much. Riley stayed quiet through it all. She never liked how grief became a spectacle, never liked how some only remembered the fallen when the calendar told them to. For her, remembrance lived in everyday choices, in dignity, in never letting the stories of the gone be reduced to hashtags and hashtags alone. But that year, something changed. Betty, the cafe owner, approached her one morning as she sipped her coffee in the booth that had unofficially, then officially, become hers. "We want to do something different this year," Betty said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Not just a service, a walk, a silent walk, through town. For the ones who never made it home, we thought maybe you could lead it." Riley looked up. The diner was already half full, and ears perked up subtly, like everyone was waiting for her answer. She didn't say yes right away. She looked down into her mug, the swirl of dark coffee circling like old memories. Faces flashed behind her eyes. Soldiers she'd served with, laughed with, bled beside. Not all of them were gone, but not all of them were here either. She nodded. "I'll walk." The announcement spread faster than anyone expected. A silent march of honor. No speeches, no music, just footsteps. A path through town that would end at the small war memorial outside City Hall. On the morning of the walk, hundreds gathered. Veterans in old uniforms. Teenagers with names written on their shirts. Gold Star mothers clutching framed photos. Bikers, teachers, children. They all came without fanfare. At the front stood Riley. She wore no medals, just a simple black shirt with the word "Remember" stenciled in white across the chest. The walk began with the slowest step. Boots on pavement, sneakers on grass. Wheelchairs rolling over cracks in the sidewalk. The sound was steady, reverent. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. By the time they reached the memorial, the group had doubled in size. And when Riley stepped forward and placed a single white rose at the base of the stone, every hand followed. Red roses, yellow, dog tags, notes. A mountain of memory at the foot of one small wall. Later that day, back at the diner, someone suggested making it annual. Someone else said, "Call it the Riley Walk." She shook her head. "Don't name it after me. Name it after them." And so they did. The Walk of Quiet Valor. Every May 28th. Every year. Summer arrived like it always did. A little late, a little loud. The heat pulled people back outside. Lawn chairs returned to porches. Farmers' markets opened. Kids cannonballed into backyard pools. Life buzzed again. Riley moved through it all with her usual quiet steps. But something was different. She'd started writing. Not a book, not a memoir, just notes, fragments, reflections scribbled into a weather-worn notebook she kept beside her coffee pot. Pages like, "Today, a woman thanked me for being visible. I don't feel visible. I feel like a mirror. People only see themselves in what I carry." Or, "The prosthetic hurts when it rains. So does the silence. I wonder if they know that sometimes bravery is just not canceling your plans." One day, Clara found the notebook while looking for sugar. She didn't read much, just a few lines. Then she asked, "Why don't you share this?" Riley shrugged. "It's not for applause, it's just to make sense of it all." Clara nodded but said nothing else. 2 weeks later, she handed Riley a surprise, a book. Published, professionally bound. On the cover, "Quiet Strength, Notes from the Walk," by E. Riley. Riley stared at it for a long time. "You didn't?" "I did," Clara smiled. "I used a local press, nothing big, just a few hundred copies. For the women you've mentored, for the kids who look up to you, for the ones who need it." Riley didn't speak, just hugged her. The book spread slowly, not through campaigns, through hands, through word of mouth, through classrooms and counseling centers. Copies started appearing in VA lobbies and military libraries. One quote was underlined more than any other. "You don't have to roar to be heard. You just have to stand." And people did. The cafe was busier than usual that morning, not because of a special event, not because of a new menu item, just energy, buzz, the way certain days feel like they're building towards something. Riley sat in the corner booth, black coffee in hand, watching the front door as it swung open and shut. A young woman in uniform walked in, glanced around, then made a beeline for the booth. "You don't know me," she said, "but I know you." Riley gestured to the seat. "Sit." The girl did. She looked nervous, determined. "I was in a rough place last year. I didn't think I could keep going. Then someone handed me your book. I read it in one night. And the next day, I enlisted." She placed a photograph on the table. Her standing in formation, uniform crisp, eyes sharp. Riley studied it, then looked up. "You earned that. I just wrote a few things down." The girl shook her head. "You did more than that. You changed my life." From behind the counter, Betty watched them with a soft smile. More customers came in. More uniforms, more quiet salutes. By noon, half the cafe was filled with people who had once been touched by Riley's story. Veterans, recruits, teachers, writers, kids, survivors. Someone stood up and said, "We've been thinking. It's time this booth has a new name." Riley raised an eyebrow. "It already has one." "No," the man said. "It's bigger than a booth now. This whole place, this table, this town, this movement has your heart in it. We want to call it what it really is." He held up a new plaque. "The Riley Table, where strength sits quietly." The room broke into applause. Not the loud kind, the grateful kind, the respectful kind. And as Riley stood, hand on her heart, surrounded by people whose lives she'd touched without ever asking for thanks, she finally let the moment in. Not for glory, not for pride, but for proof. Proof that one woman walking with grace on a carbon leg into a diner full of doubters could shift the world without ever raising her voice. And in that corner, beneath her portrait and above the table that bore her name, hung a final sign, painted in simple, steady strokes. "Veterans always welcome. So are heroes in disguise." The plaque above the table didn't change how she walked into the cafe. Her steps were still slow, steady. She still paused at the door to let the warmth hit her face after the cool morning air, still nodded to Betty, still chose black coffee before conversation. But something in the air had shifted. People stopped whispering when she entered, not because they feared her, but because they'd grown to know her. Because somehow her presence reminded them to listen, to speak with care, to mean what they said. The sign read, "Where strength sits quietly," and she carried that burden with the same grace she'd carried her rucksack through deserts and deployments and fire. But she wasn't just a symbol anymore, she was a leader. It started small, an email from a university professor who taught leadership studies. He'd built a new course called Silent Valor, the language of service, and asked if Riley would contribute a few recorded insights. Just reflections, not lectures. He promised no pressure. She thought about it for 3 days before replying with a single line. "If they're listening to silence, I'll speak." She recorded her messages at home, seated at her kitchen table, the dog snoring softly nearby. No makeup, no studio, just a voice and stories carved from memory. One clip, just 40 seconds long, became required watching in 3 separate programs by the end of the semester. "They didn't give me respect when I walked in. They gave me stares. What mattered was that I didn't shrink. Respect can come late, but it never comes if you sit down before you're seen." Those words hit deeper than motivational posters or staged lectures ever could. A young woman in Texas dropped out of a sorority to pursue ROTC after watching that clip. A boy in Vermont gave a speech at his graduation, quoting Riley's line. "Respect can come late," he said, "but I'm going to stand until it gets here." People were listening. And not just to her words, to her walk, to how she handled the weight of being watched. Because fame, even the quiet kind, wears heavy. She started getting letters from soldiers in active combat zones. Not just thanks, but confessions. One came from a corporal deployed in Syria. It read, "I keep your picture taped inside my bunk, not because I know you, but because when I want to give up, I look at your eyes and I remember you didn't." Riley sent him a patch from her uniform. No note, just the patch. He wrote back a month later, "It's sewn into my vest now. I'll carry you with me." Then came the award she didn't expect, the Presidential Civilian Medal of Honor. The call came from someone high up in the Department of Defense. She didn't remember their name, just the way they cleared their throat before saying, "There's been a movement started by soldiers, educators, and civilians to formally recognize your impact. It's unprecedented, but earned." She didn't say no, but she asked for one condition. "If I have to stand on that stage, I want to bring 10 others with me. Not generals, not politicians. Ordinary people who've stood tall in the quiet." They agreed. And so she stood in a line of 11. A widow who ran grief groups. A teacher who taught her story without ever knowing she'd hear about it. A biker who started his own charity. A girl from that middle school library. A single mom who mentored new enlistees after almost taking her life. Each one stepped onto the stage with her. Each one was handed a medal. And in her speech, just under 2 minutes, she said only this: "I didn't change the world. I just stood in one room and didn't sit down when they laughed. If that's enough to be remembered, then let's make sure others are seen too. The quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones still standing." Back in her hometown, a group of volunteers began building something behind the cafe. A garden. Not flowers, not fountains. A peace garden, designed by veterans, for veterans. Every stone was carved with a word: strength, grief, grace, fire, return. And in the middle, a bench. On the backrest, etched deeply, "This is where she stood." Kids started using the garden after school. Veterans brought coffee and sat in silence. Some cried, some laughed, some just breathed in a way they hadn't in years. And one by one, strangers started bringing others there. Widows brought each other. Students brought classmates. Soldiers brought brothers. Because something about the air around that bench made it okay to fall apart and put yourself back together, it became known unofficially as the Heart Place. People said healing happened there even when you didn't know you were hurting. One morning, as spring tilted into summer again, Riley sat on the bench, eyes closed, sunlight warming the side of her face. She was older now, slower, but no less steady. She was joined by Clara, now a first lieutenant. "I put in for command," Clara said, sitting beside her. Riley opened her eyes. "And?" "They said I'm young, that I don't have the presence for it." Riley raised an eyebrow. "Did you tell them presence isn't volume?" Clara grinned. "I might have quoted you." Riley nodded, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, flat box. Inside, Clara's name pin, the new one already made. "How?" "I knew before you did," Riley said, "because I watched how others stood when you entered a room." Clara blinked fast. "You think I'm ready?" "I think you were ready the moment you stopped needing them to say it first." A year later, Riley stood in front of a boot camp class. Her last one, she'd decided. She wore her uniform, her full dress. And as she looked into the faces of the recruits, so young, so sharp, so sure and unsure all at once, she said one final lesson. "You'll be called weak before you're called brave. You'll be ignored before you're saluted. And you'll walk alone before anyone marches beside you. But if you stand long enough, they'll come. One by one, until you're not alone anymore. That's how you change a world." She stepped down. They stood and saluted, every single one. And she returned the salute, slow, deliberate. a goodbye. Not to them, to the girl she used to be, the one who walked into a diner and didn't flinch. Back in her home, the light filtered through the windows, soft and golden. Her dog, now graying, lay curled in the corner. The notebook was full, the shelf lined with letters, photos, patches. And outside the cafe, beneath the sign that now read, "The Riley Table," where strength sits quietly, another sign had been added below it. "Come as you are, leave seen." Riley sat at her table one last time, coffee in hand. The sun rose slowly behind her, and the door stayed open. Always. She never really liked the word retirement. It sounded too final, like you stop being what you were and trade it in for something softer, easier. Riley didn't want easy. She didn't crave rest. What she wanted, what she always wanted, was usefulness. So even after stepping away from the front lines of speeches and ceremony, she kept showing up in the shadows. She taught writing once a week at a transitional housing center, mostly to veterans who didn't talk much. Men who had seen things they wouldn't say out loud. Women who still jumped at loud noises. Riley never asked them to tell their stories. She asked them to write about their boots. "Start there," she told them, "where your feet were, where they carried you." It worked. Not immediately, but slowly, the pages filled. About dust, about rain, about running, about kneeling in blood, about standing when you had nothing left. One man handed her his notebook after class. "Don't read it," he said. "Just keep it. Someone should." She placed it on her shelf next to all the others, a row of books never published, but deeply lived. Then came the visitor. A woman, mid-40s, hair tied back in a practical bun, eyes too alert to be casual. She introduced herself as Commander Leah Stanton, Naval Intelligence, 22 years in. "I've followed your story for years," she said. "What you built here, it's not just healing people, it's organizing them." Riley sipped her coffee and said nothing. Stanton continued. "I'm putting together a civilian task force, something new, something under the radar. Veterans leading crisis response teams, domestic and overseas, quiet ops, real impact. I want you involved." Riley raised an eyebrow. "You want me to train them?" Stanton shook her head. "I want you to pick them." And just like that, Riley was back in it. Not boots on the ground this time, but blueprint in hand. She spent the next 6 months crisscrossing the country, visiting shelters, counseling centers, forgotten bases. She shook hands with janitors who'd once led units through minefields. She sat with widows who knew how to rebuild lives from nothing. She watched how people entered rooms, not who had medals, but who others leaned toward when things got tense. She built a team. Not the fastest, not the strongest, but the most resilient. And then she handed them over to Stanton, one by one, like polished stones. "They won't shine loud," she warned, "but they'll never crack under pressure." The first mission was local, a flood zone where the government hadn't arrived fast enough. Riley's team got there in 24 hours, built bridges, evacuated families, no press, no glory. But weeks later, a kid posted a video of a woman in combat boots and a tank top carrying his grandmother over her shoulders through waist-high water. The caption read, "I don't know who she was, but she saved my whole world." That woman had once sat at Riley's table, unsure if she'd ever wear boots again. Back at the cafe, the rhythm continued. The bench in the garden was worn smooth by stories. The Walk of Quiet Valor had grown into a national movement, now in 12 cities, with an app that let people light virtual candles in honor of those they'd lost. The scholarships doubled, then tripled, then turned into fellowships funding not just school, but change. One recipient started a startup that created low-cost mental health clinics near military bases. Another, a former medic, built a trauma-first training program for EMTs. Each one carried a simple black wristband engraved with Riley's mantra, "Still standing." Riley wore hers, too. even as her leg began to slow, even as the miles grew longer, even as the weight of years settled into her bones. She didn't stop. It was a Tuesday when the pain became more than a whisper. She was climbing the steps of a local VFW hall, there for a small ceremony, a plaque for someone else, when the joint where her prosthetic met flesh buckled. She caught herself barely with a sharp inhale. A young Marine standing nearby jumped to help. She waved him off, standing with that stubborn tilt of her chin the world knew too well. But when she got home, she sat for a long time, just sat and thought. She didn't fear aging, but she feared leaving the work unfinished. So she wrote a letter, her first real letter to the people she'd mentored. It began, "If you're reading this, I'm probably home, feet up, dog snoring, maybe I've slowed, but I haven't stopped thinking about what comes next. And here's the truth. You are what comes next." She wrote not about herself, but about them, their names, their strength, their stories. She gave them permission to surpass her, to take her name and outgrow it. And she ended with, "Don't carry me. I was never meant to be your weight. Carry what we built. Carry what you are. And if someone ever laughs at you the way they laughed at me that day in the diner, just stand and wait. We'll come." The day she handed that letter off, she did something she hadn't done in years. She walked through the front door of a boot camp base unannounced. The drill sergeant froze mid-yell. Recruits stood straighter. She didn't say much. Just walked to the front, looked them all in the eye and said, "Everything you're about to go through will feel like too much. That's the point. Because later, when you're out there and the world is watching or not watching, and the noise gets loud or the silence gets worse, you'll know you didn't break. And that knowing will save lives, maybe even your own." Then she left. Back into the sun, back toward whatever came next. The letter she wrote didn't stay within its envelope. It was passed, copied, shared across networks Riley had never touched. One day, a recruit in Alaska found it printed and folded into the side pocket of her bunk. A week later, a Navy corpsman read it aloud at a funeral for a fellow medic who'd taken his own life. By the end of the month, it had become a foundational text at a resilience workshop on the East Coast, not as policy, not as doctrine, but as testimony. They called it the Stand Letter, and Riley, whether she meant to or not, had written her creed. She didn't know this at first, but one afternoon, sitting in her garden with a fleece blanket and her dog stretched out nearby, a knock came at the gate. A girl stood there, maybe 18, maybe less, uniform too new, eyes too tired. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. "They gave me your letter." Riley opened the gate. No questions, just space. The girl sat beside her on the porch and cried, said nothing, just cried. And Riley didn't press. She poured tea, let the silence be what it needed to be. Only after an hour did the girl finally whisper, "I didn't think I'd make it past last week." Riley looked over, eyes soft. "You did," she said, "and that's why you're already stronger than you think." That was the beginning of something new, unplanned, unstructured, but real. People began arriving, not in buses, not as pilgrims, just as people. Sometimes it was one at a time, sometimes 3. Once 9 arrived on motorcycles and slept in tents on her lawn after riding cross-country from Arizona. They didn't come to meet a hero. They came to breathe. They called it Riley's Porch. And soon they started leaving things behind. Not gifts, not tributes. Reminders. A bootlace tied to the railing. A dog tag pressed into the porch beam. A coin tucked under the flower pots. And each one had a story. One man, a Marine with trembling hands, left a photo of a squad mate and said he would have come here if he'd made it. Riley placed the photo inside next to the others. Her walls became a mosaic of memory, a museum of the unseen. Eventually, people began to notice something else. She was writing again. Late at night. Early in the morning, Not in notebooks this time, on her old laptop, screen dimmed, coffee at her elbow. It started with fragments, then full chapters, then a manuscript. But this wasn't a memoir. It wasn't even about her. It was about them, about the voices that had filled her porch, her booth, her phone, her memory. She called it The Fire We Carry. The first publisher said, "It's powerful, but can we add more about you?" She said no. "If they want my story, they can find it," she told them. "This isn't about spotlight. It's about torchlight." Another publisher agreed. The book hit quietly. No bestseller banners, no flashy interviews, but word spread through barracks, through clinics, through Sunday church halls, and Tuesday night AA meetings. It became something passed hand to hand, left behind in waiting rooms, handed to someone right before they broke. One night, Clara called from overseas. Her voice was tinny but strong. "We're heading into a rough zone tomorrow," she said. Didn't want to go quiet without checking in. Riley didn't flinch, didn't panic. She just said, "You remember what you carry?" Clara hesitated, then said, "Yes." "Then carry it loud," Riley said. That night, Riley sat on the porch until dawn, didn't move, didn't sleep, just waited. And when her phone buzzed the next morning with one word, "safe," she whispered a thank you only the stars could hear. A few months later, she got a letter from the White House. They wanted to name a program after her, a national initiative for veteran reintegration. The Riley Act. She read it twice, set it down, and stared out the window. Not because she doubted the honor, but because something about it felt final, like the world was preparing to preserve her while she was still very much alive. She picked up the phone and called Clara. "They want to name a law after me." "Well," Clara said, "you kind of built a quiet revolution. I'm not done yet." "Then let them name the law, and you just keep building the rest." And she did. The Riley Act passed with bipartisan support and a standing ovation. But back home, Riley was still meeting strangers on her porch, still helping someone learn to sleep without nightmares. Still walking the trail behind Betty's with a cane now, her pace slower, her presence no less commanding. Betty hung a new sign at the cafe. This one wasn't just for Riley. It read, "This table saved lives. Now it's your turn." And people sat there, not to meet her, but to meet each other, to share, to listen, to begin again. One evening, just before her birthday, Riley received a package. No return address. Inside, a folded American flag carefully pressed, and a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. "I saw you once. You didn't see me, but you kept me from ending everything. I carried this flag through my last tour. It's yours now. Thank you for standing." She placed the flag beside the others. There were 6 now, each one a life that had come home because she hadn't sat down in a diner that day. Years passed. The garden grew, the cafe expanded, with a second location in another town, run by a veteran who once cried into his eggs and couldn't imagine being whole again. The porch became a retreat center, informal but sacred. No fees, no schedule, just space. Riley began using a wheelchair more often. Not out of defeat, out of peace. She'd walked far enough, and her legacy had legs of its own now. One morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, she wheeled out onto the porch, a new journal in her lap. And on the first page she wrote, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who keeps walking because you did." They called it the circle, but to Riley it had always been more of a fire. Not one that burned wildly, but one that stayed alive through winters, kept others warm. That's how she built it. That's how she meant for it to last. But fires, even strong ones, need tending, and in her quiet way, she'd been preparing for that. Clara had been stepping in more often, not because Riley asked, but because she saw it needed doing. She ran meetings, smoothed tensions, pulled new leaders into roles they didn't think they were ready for. And one day, As Riley sat watching her from the edge of a small conference in Nebraska, she smiled. She leaned toward a young mentee sitting beside her, a new recruit named Jules, barely 20. "You see her?" Riley whispered. "That's what it looks like when your legacy grows legs of its own." Jules nodded. "She's got your spine." "No," Riley said. "She's got hers. That's the point." But the fire was about to be tested. It started with budget cuts. A quiet memo from somewhere high, faceless names, spreadsheet logic. The Riley Act's funding was on the chopping block. The mentorship programs, scholarships, and transitional support initiatives were marked non-essential. Non-essential. The word lit something in Clara like dry tinder. "They want to strip everything we built," she said, slamming the packet down on Riley's kitchen table. "Say it doesn't show direct ROI." Riley didn't flinch, just sipped her tea. "They'll come for the garden next," Clara went on. "The cafe table, the porch programs. Say it's just sentiment." Riley looked up, steady as ever. "Then we remind them sentiment saves lives." Clara launched into action. She rallied the other circle leaders, many of them now running their own branches across the country. They organized data, collected testimony, brought in veterans who had gone from suicidal to sober, from homeless to housed because of the programs the Act funded. But still, it wasn't enough. The hearing was scheduled. A single session that would determine the future of all of it. They asked Riley to testify. She declined. "You don't need me standing there," she told Clara. "You need to show them what happens when I'm not in the room." And it still stands. Clara hesitated. "But they listen to you." "They will listen to you," Riley said, "because I did." The day of the hearing, Riley watched from home. The room was packed. Clara stood at the podium, not in uniform, but in quiet authority. She didn't pound the table. She didn't play politics. She told stories of a woman who'd come to the porch after 3 suicide attempts and was now running a trauma clinic in Chicago. Of a 14-year-old who read Quiet Strength and decided to become a grief counselor instead of giving into despair. Of herself, a girl who once flinched at every shadow and now stood leading the people who'd once carried her. The Riley Act didn't just fund programs, she said. It funded people. And those people are saving lives every day. Not by force, not by flash, but by presence. You cut this, and you cut a lifeline. When the hearing ended, the vote was postponed. But the pressure had worked. 2 days later, funding was restored. Clara returned to the porch with tears she didn't try to hide. Riley just opened her arms. "Now you know," she whispered, "what it means to fight without firing a shot." That fall, the cafe held a quiet celebration. They added a new plaque to the wall. This one didn't name Riley. It named Clara and the circle. And underneath, the words, "Still standing, now leading." Riley watched from the back, her chair nestled beside the fire pit. The sky was painted in soft oranges and deepening blue. She didn't say much anymore. She didn't have to. The echoes were louder than ever. Then came the letter from Jules. It arrived handwritten, folded in perfect creases, ink slightly smudged. "I deployed last month. I didn't tell you because I wanted to make you proud when I came back. But here's what I realized in the sand and the silence. I was already proud. Because I came from you, from your porch, from your story. I saw myself in your stillness, in the way you showed up without armor. You gave me permission to be soft and sharp. Thank you for showing me that being gentle is not the opposite of being brave." Riley pressed the letter to her chest and wept for the first time in months. Not from pain, from release. From knowing the legacy had turned into movement, and the movement into momentum. As winter crept in again, the town prepared for another walk of quiet valor. It was the 5th year now. Dozens of towns had adopted the model. Some walked through silence, some through song. But all carried names in their hands. Riley wasn't strong enough to lead anymore. So Clara pushed her in a wheelchair at the head of the line. Beside her walked Jules. Behind them, hundreds. Some in uniform, some in grief, all in honor. And as they reached the memorial garden, Riley whispered, "Let me stand." Clara tried to argue, but Jules knelt and helped. And for one more moment, with knees trembling and jaw clenched, Riley stood. Clara placed a hand on her back, steadying her. Jules held her arm, and together they laid a wreath of poppies and wildflowers, not because it was tradition, but because it was thanks. That night, back on the porch with a blanket over her lap and the fire crackling low, Riley whispered, "I think I'm ready." Clara nodded. "To stop?" "No," Riley smiled. "To let go." She looked around at what had grown, not just in soil, but in souls. And, for the first time in a long time, she felt weightless. A few weeks later, Riley passed quietly in her sleep. No pain, just peace, just breath, and then no breath. News spread like a heartbeat, not viral, not blaring, just steady, real. The cafe closed for one day. The porch filled with people who didn't know each other, but hugged like they did. Veterans gathered around fires from Oregon to Georgia. Clara read from the letter Riley had left, written just weeks before. "I was never the point. The point was that we could, that we did, that you still will. Don't mourn too loudly. I'd hate to be the reason you stopped building. Instead, keep showing up, keep standing, keep being loud in the places that matter." They didn't hold a funeral. They held a vigil. And across the country, porch lights flicked on. Candles were lit. And the phrase that started on a napkin in a diner became a global whisper. "Still standing.